Hi everyone, this is William from the Headphone Experience. I'm here today with my full review of the Ifi Zen Can. Usually I do my videos at night, but I'm running behind schedule and do want to apologize. It's been about 10 days since I've got a chance to do a video, but anyone that's watched me for a while knows that my day job is lawn care. I own and run a small lawn care business, and the lawn care season started up about a week ago, so been pretty busy with that. So I do need to push myself a little bit to get some reviews out, but unfortunately I do have to have a daytime job because the $50 or $60 a month that I'm pulling in from YouTube just doesn't pay the bills. So until that increases a little bit, I'm gonna be a part-time reviewer and a full-time lawn care guy. So anyway, this is the Ifi Zen Can, and this was loaned to me by Ifi Audio. They are out of Southport, UK. That's where their headquarters are. And this currently sells for $169.99. This is a fully balanced headphone amp, unlike the Zen DAC, which is a DAC and amp combination. This is just an amp. This has 3 analog inputs, and obviously because it doesn't have a DAC, it doesn't have any digital inputs, but it has 3 analog inputs, RCA inputs, a 3.5 millimeter single-ended input, and a 4.4 millimeter balanced Pentagon input. It has 3 outputs, and that would be your 6.3 millimeter headphone output, your 4.4 millimeter balanced Pentagon output, and on the rear of this unit is another 4.4 millimeter Pentagon output to connect it to another amp. These specs are from Ifi, that they say that the single-ended output of this headphone output is 1600 milliwatts into 32 ohms, and the balanced output is 1890 milliwatts into 64 ohms. And I'm kind of wondering why they went with that number. Why did they give us the wattage into 64 ohms? Just about every headphone manufacturer or headphone amp manufacturer I know of gives the figure into 32 ohms. And I don't know if we can assume that 1890 milliwatts would be doubled into 32 ohms. It's possible, but not necessarily the case. It depends if the amp puts out enough current to double the wattage when you cut the impedance in half. So anyway, but it's still rated at 1890 milliwatts into 64 ohms from the balanced output. The total harmonic distortion is rated at 0.006% from the single-ended output, and from the balanced output 0.0007%. You got an extra 0 in there on the balanced output. So the signal to noise ratio is rated at 118 decibels from the single-ended output, and 120 decibels from the balanced output. This unit has 4 gain settings, which is a little unusual. It's the first amp I've seen with 4 gain settings, and the boost is either 0, 6, 12, or 18 decibels. The size of this unit is 6.2 inches wide. It's 4.6 inches deep. That would include the volume knob, and 1.4 inches tall. And according to Ifi, it weighs in at 515 grams or 1.14 pounds. It's got a couple of interesting features. One would be the XBass, which is basically a bass boost that works in the analog spectrum, and then it has a 3D, sort of a matrix effect that from my experience, what Ifi claims is it gives you a more speaker-like sound instead of listening to headphones. From my experience, it does increase the size of the soundstage a little bit. It's kind of interesting. I wanted to mention what my source was. I'm using my HP using my HP desktop computer with a USB cable going to the Zen DAC, and the Zen DAC is then feeding this unit with a 4.4 millimeter Pentacon cable that was actually supplied to me by Ifi. Very nice little cable, very heavy gauge. I think this is like 16 gauge, but has a 4.4 millimeter Pentacon connection on each end. One end plugs into the back of your Zen DAC, and then the other end plugs into the end of the back of the Zen Can. And it's just the right length that you can either put the two units side by side or stack them, which is really nice because, you know, depending on your desktop or whatever, for me, putting them side by side works better. I had them here and they fit under my monitor that way, but most people I see stacked them. My music that I used to review this has been my standard mix of some rock, pop, electronic music, a lot of acoustical music with female vocals and a little bit of classical mixed in. And I did, I kind of lost my place here, but anyway, also I want to mention that this uses a 5-volt DC power supply. I will give you a closer look here. On the front, you start out with, you've got your power button, which the Zen DAC doesn't have an on-off switch. This does, and it's kind of nice because if you leave it on all the time, it does get pretty warm. This is a Class A amp, and it doesn't get hot, but it definitely puts off some heat. You've got your input button here. This cycles through your 3 inputs, your RCA, your 3.5 millimeter or your 4.4 millimeter inputs that are all on the back. Then you got your gain control, and this button cycles through your 4 gain levels, which once again are 0, 6, 12, or 18 dB of boost on your gain. You've got your volume knob. It's solid, it's smooth, and it balances out pretty well, even, right when you just start turning it. A lot of volume controls. Usually the right channel kicks in a little earlier than the left channel, and it's barely noticeable on this. Then you've got your 6.3 millimeter single-ended headphone out. You've got your 4.4 millimeter balanced headphone out. And then this switch here, this is for both the XBass and the 3D. And the way this works, if you push it once, it kicks in the bass boost. If you push it a second time, it shuts off the bass boost but kicks in the 3D. If you push it a third time, you get both bass boost and 3D. And then if you push it a fourth time, it turns both off. So you can use the bass boost and the 3D at the same time if you want. The headphones that I used in reviewing this unit would be the Olo S4R closed-back studio headphone that was loaned to me. That's already gone back. And the LSA HP2, which is one of my favorite headphones in the world right now. I rated it my headphone of the year for 2020, most bang for the buck product. The Hi-Fi Man Sindara, the Hi-Fi Man HE560, and the Philips SHP 9500. Getting into the sound, basically this comes across as being very neutral. I'm not picking up, it doesn't seem overly bassy. I don't hear any emphasis anywhere. Real good extension on both ends. Maybe just a slight little bit on the warm side of neutral. Through the mid-range is where I hear that. It's got kind of it's not a dry sounding amp at all. It's, you know, got kind of a smooth kind of liquid sound to it, and it just doesn't seem like it strains at all. Like, you know, it's a very easygoing amp, and it's very easy to listen to. I don't hear anything harsh coming out of it. The detail and resolution is very good with this amp. It's not the absolute last word in resolution. I wouldn't consider it analytical. It does not have an analytical sound. Like I said, it's more of a little bit of a smoother, more liquid sound, and it gives up just a tiny little bit of detail compared to some of the more analytical amps, and I will talk about that in a minute. I did compare this to a couple other amps. But mostly it's just, it's never harsh. It's not a fatiguing amp. It's an amp you can listen to for hours without getting tired, unless you're listening to a really analytical headphone. And then if you are, it does kind of take the edge off. It smooths it out a little bit. I wanted to talk about a little bit about the XBass and the 3D. In my first impressions video, I mentioned that the XBass was, I think it's intended for like IEMs and earbuds and that sort of thing. And I'm more into full-size headphones, and I said that it was really just too much for me. I mean, I don't consider myself a bass head. I like my music anywhere between neutral to a slight boost in the bass, mid-bass, sub-bass, all that, you know, maybe like 3 decibels. This seems to be a little more than that, and I said that it was a little bit too much, but I did find an exception to that. If I'm listening to low volume, and I noticed this with my hi-fi man Sundara, and the Sundara is known to not, it has a very neutral bass. It doesn't emphasize the bass at all. And I noticed that if I was listening at low volume with the Sundara, the bass boost worked pretty well on most music, unless the music had an emphasis to the bass. So at low volumes, I did enjoy the XBass. The 3D effect, I noticed, or what I'm hearing listening to the 3D is kind of an expansion of the soundstage. It's not drastic, it's subtle, there's not a huge difference, but in the past, my experience has been that if an amp tries to create, if they go too far with emphasizing, you know, the soundstage of the 3D effect, it usually ends up sounding unnatural or can distort the sound a little bit. So this isn't enough to really cause any distortion. It still sounds pretty much the same, but what I'm noticing is the vocals seem to become a little bit more distant, and that seems to give the soundstage more depth, which does create more of a speaker image where you're listening to the speakers from across the room. And I'm noticing a little bit, just a slight emphasis in cymbals and some of the higher frequencies, which gives it the impression of having a little bit more width to the soundstage. So like I said, it's subtle, but you know, it's still clean, it's not distorted, and you know, I'm not saying it's going to be for everyone. Usually I don't like that sort of thing, or don't usually use it, but it's subtle enough that I did think it was kind of an enjoyable. I did want to talk about the outputs on this, because this is a balanced amp. You do have the 2 outputs, and like the Zen DAC, without a doubt I like the sound better from the balanced output on this. The balanced output on both units, the Zen DAC and the Zen Can, seems to have a little more detail and resolution. It sounds a little bit cleaner than the single-ended output, and there seems to be better stereo separation and a little bit wider soundstage and a little more depth of the soundstage. So I do enjoy the balanced output from both of these. Unfortunately, because this is a 4.4 millimeter Pentagon output, I only have 2 cables that I can use on this, and they both have 3.5 millimeter connections at the headphone end, so that does limit me to about, I've got about 3 or 4 headphones that do use 3.5 millimeter connections, and I couldn't use some of my higher end headphones from the balanced output because they have 4-pin mini XLR connections at the ear cup end, and the balanced cables that I have for those headphones have a 4-pin XLR connection at the amp end. So I'm going to have to see if I can get an adapter to go from the 4.4 millimeter Pentagon to a 4-pin full-size XLR so I can use it with some of my other headphones. And then I did want to, mention that as far as I'm concerned, just about any amp that is designed as balanced is going to sound better from its balanced output. That's been the case with every balanced amp I have listened to or reviewed so far. If it was designed as balanced, and if it has both balanced and single-ended outputs, it's going to sound better from its balanced output, and that's been the case with this. But that being said, I don't really think that amps with balanced outputs are necessarily better than single-ended amps that are designed as single-ended. I think a single-ended amp can be designed to sound just as good as a balanced amp. So to me, I know a lot of people are really excited about an amp, whether it's balanced or not. I've heard countless people say, I need to get a balanced amp, or I got a balanced amp and it's so much better. But in my opinion, it's because, if it's designed as balanced, it's going to sound better from its balanced output. A lot of people are thinking it was the cable that made the difference, and I do believe that an analog cable can make a small difference, but I believe most of the difference they're hearing is because of using the balanced output. I wanted to talk about the power output of this because that's something that really impresses me about this amp. My best power test that I have, the hardest to drive headphone that I have, is the Hi-Fi Man HE560. It's what I usually use to test the power output of an amp, because the 560 will play loud when underpowered, but it doesn't sound good. It sounds harsh and it sounds thin. It lacks weight to the bass when underpowered. That headphone needs a lot of current. It's a planar magnetic driver, and I think it's around 50 ohms or something like that, but it needs a lot of current through it for the bass to sound solid. Okay, unfortunately, I do not have a balanced cable for that. Well, I do have a balanced cable, but it's got a 4-pin XLR connection. I don't have a balanced cable I can use with this amp. So I had to use the single-ended output of this amp to test my HE560. And to tell you the truth, I'm extremely impressed by the power output of this amp from its single-ended output. In fact, this thing did a better job with the HE560 from its single-ended output than some amps costing 10 times the amount of this did from their single-ended outputs. This has 4 gain settings, as I mentioned. The first 2, no, they do not have enough power for the 560 to make it sound right. Getting up to the 3rd setting, it actually does a pretty good job with the 560. It's not 100% there, but it's getting real close, and the 3rd gain setting on this does a very good job driving the HE560. The 4th setting is outstanding. Even from the single-ended output, this thing takes complete control of the 560, and the bass sounds the way it should. It's got the weight to it, and it sounds good. And even with the 560, by the time the volume setting is probably at 10 o'clock, it's playing loud, and by the time I get to 11 o'clock, it is, you know, on the verge of being too loud for me to listen to. So there's still a lot of volume knob left, and this does an excellent job, even from the single-ended output with the 560, which means the Hi-Fi Man Aria, which is easier to drive than the 560, this will have more than enough power to drive that amp and make it sound, or that headphone, and make it sound good. And even on the third setting should do a pretty good job, because I tried the Hi-Fi Man Sandara on this, and I do have a balanced cable that matches up with this amp and the Sandara. And the first two settings, the first one didn't have enough power, the first gain setting. The second one did a pretty good job with the Sandara. The third was perfect for the Sandara. And in fact, by the time I got to 10 o'clock on the volume knob, it was too loud to listen to, even on the third gain setting. And this is from the balanced output. And then on the fourth setting, the Sandara, by the time I got to like 8:30, 9 o'clock, it was already too loud. So this does have plenty of power, even from the single-ended output, for the Sandara, the Aria, even the 560. And, you know, if you don't have a balanced cable right now, you're going to be able to get by with the single-ended output. But somewhere down the line, you are going to want to get the balanced cable, because this amp does sound better from the balanced output. Okay, something else that I wanted to talk about, and I'm very much impressed about this also. The way I test headphone amps for their background noise is I have an old pair of Sony DJ headphones. What are they? MDR V700. They are very efficient. Some like 112 decibels at 1 milliwatt. They're more efficient than most IEMs or earbuds. So anyway, but they can handle a lot of power. So what I do is I take my amp turned on, but with the source turned off, or not off. Like if I'm using a CD player, I'll put it to pause. In this case, I'm using my computer, and you know, I'll set it to pause. So the amp is on. I'll plug the headphones on, and I'll start with the lowest gain setting, turn the volume as far as I can until I hear hiss. And with these very sensitive headphones, most amps, I'm going to hear hiss by the time, you know, I get to, you know, 2, 3 o'clock on the volume knob, and it's going to get louder. Well, with this amp, on the lowest gain setting, I have absolutely no hiss, dead quiet. The second setting, I'm not picking up any hiss till I get all the way to about 5 o'clock, which, I mean, that headphone, I'd probably be listening to the headphone at like 8 or 9 o'clock, and yet there's no background hiss until the volume knob gets to 5 o'clock. So something I'm never going to hear, ever, even with the sensitive headphone. And like I said, those are as sensitive or even more so than most IEMs. Anyway, by the time I got all the way up to high gain, I started picking up a little bit of hiss at like 2 to 3 o'clock, but that's on the highest gain, and that's a very sensitive headphone, so still very impressed. Something else that really impressed me about this amp is I can, even with a very sensitive headphone like the Sony DJ headphones, I can have them plugged in and turn the power on or off with the headphone in and hear absolutely nothing. No click, no pop, nothing at all. Absolutely silent, turning this amp on and off with the headphone plugged in. So another thing that I'm very impressed about, because trust me, there's a lot of amps out there that you turn your amp on or off with the headphone plugged in, you're going to get a loud pop, and especially with a really sensitive headphone like that. Excuse me a second. So I did get a chance to compare this to a couple of other amp DAC combinations. Like I said, I'm running this in combination with the Zen DAC. So it's a Zen DAC, Zen Can stack. I did have an opportunity to compare this to the topping A50S and D50S DAC and headphone stack. Excuse me again, which I think works out to a little bit higher price. This works out to about, we're about $300 for the stack. That works out more to like $450 for the stack, but I did get a chance to compare it to that. And I also have the Burson Playmate 2 in at this time, and that's one unit, but that's a combination DAC and headphone amp. And I got a chance to compare this to that, and that's also more expensive. That's about $550 for the one unit. And comparing this to the topping stack, the topping stack to me was a little more analytical. It gave me a little bit more detail, but it was a slightly drier, more analytical sound. Not saying that the topping is bad in any way. It's a great amp. So it gives you a slightly more detail than this, but this is a slightly more, a warmer, slightly more liquid sound to it. What I did notice though is, once again, I use my HE560 but only have a single-ended connection, and I tried both amps side by side, and both are rated at similar power outputs, but I did find out that the topping does not handle the 560 the way this does from its single-ended output. It probably does okay from the balanced output. I haven't had a chance to find the answer to that because I don't have the cable. But based on the single-ended outputs, this has a lot more power output than the topping A50S. This takes control of the 560, gives it a lot of weight to the bass, and it sounds excellent. The topping was struggling from its single-ended output, even on high gain, which it only has 2 gain settings. So the topping, yeah, a little more analytical, a little more detailed. This probably has like 95% of the detail of the topping stack. But this definitely has more power from its single-ended output. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to compare the balanced outputs of these two together, but anyway, that's where I was at with my comparison. I also compared this to the Burson Playmate 2, and the Burson Playmate, the sound is kind of in between the two. I would say it's in between the topping and this amp. It's just a slight difference in detail. This is just slightly less detailed than the Burson. Once again, the Burson is a little bit warmer than the topping. This is a little bit warmer than the Burson. And the Burson only has a single-ended output. The Burson is rated at 3 watts per channel, Class A. And it only has a single-ended output, and to be honest, the single-ended output of this seems to hold its own with the single-ended output of the Burson, and that should be the full power going into that. So, this is only rated at 1600 milliwatts from its single-ended output into 32 ohms, but it seems to me that either that's a very conservative rating or it's actually putting out more than that, because I haven't seen a 1600 milliwatt amp take control of the HE560 the way this does. Like I said, this seems to have more power from its single-ended output than the single-ended output of much more expensive amps that I've reviewed. So anyway, yeah, I'm very impressed by this amp. I really like it. I like the Zen DAC so much that I actually did buy it from Ifi, and very tempted to do the same with this. Don't know if it's in my budget or not, but Anyway, it's very impressive. It's got very good power from its output. It's got dead quiet background. I'm sorry, it has very good power from its single-ended output. The balanced output sounds outstanding. It's not the absolute last word in detail. It's not an analytical amp, but it's got a very smooth, liquid, enjoyable, low fatigue sound. It's small, it's got, it's versatile, it does a lot of things. And between the 4 gain settings, you're going to be able to use this with any IEM, any headphone, and I mean, short of maybe the HE6 is going to have probably enough power to drive any headphone you want, especially from the balanced output. And there's really nothing that I have bad to say about this amp. I really do like it and highly recommend it. And at $169, I think it's going to be hard to beat. So yeah, I recommend you check this amp out. So I'm going to wrap this up now. Once again, this is William from the Headphone Experience. If this video has helped you, please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. And you are all welcome to join us over at the Headphone Experience on Facebook. Hope to see you all over there. And once again, thanks for watching my video.